The evening air was calm in the quiet town of Maplewood, a peaceful place in Washington where tree-lined streets and small houses created a warm feeling of community. Inside one of those homes lived Emily Parker, a 48-year-old widow who had spent most of the last decade focusing on raising her only son, Daniel. Life had not always been easy for Emily. 10 years earlier, she had lost her husband Michael to an illness that changed everything overnight. After that day, she had quietly built a simple life around work, home, and caring for Daniel. Now Daniel was 23, tall, responsible, and thoughtful, and Emily often felt proud when she watched him grow into the kind young man his father would have admired. On that particular evening, Emily stood in the kitchen preparing dinner while the soft sound of a piano song played on the radio. Outside, the sun was slowly setting behind the trees, painting the sky with warm orange light. Daniel walked through the front door after work, placing his backpack near the wall before stepping into the kitchen. "Hey, Mom," he said with a tired but gentle smile. Emily turned and smiled back warmly. "Long day?" she asked. Daniel nodded while washing his hands at the sink. "The usual," he said. "Busy, but not terrible." Emily placed 2 plates on the table and they sat down together like they had done thousands of times before. Their dinners were usually calm moments where they talked about work, neighbors, and simple daily things. But tonight, Daniel seemed unusually quiet. Emily noticed he kept looking at her as if he wanted to say something but was unsure how to begin. She had always been good at reading him, even when he tried to hide his thoughts. After a few minutes, she gently asked, "Is something on your mind?" Daniel hesitated and took a sip of water. "Maybe," he said slowly. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair, curious but calm. Daniel had always been open with her, but tonight there was a seriousness in his voice she had not heard before. Finally, he put down his fork and looked directly at her. "Mom, can I ask you something personal?" Emily nodded without hesitation. "Of course." Daniel took a breath before speaking again. "Have you ever thought about living differently? I mean, not just working and coming home every day." Emily raised her eyebrows slightly, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" she asked. Daniel seemed to search for the right words. "I mean, have you ever thought about starting a new chapter of your life?" Emily felt a small wave of emotion pass through her chest. For years, she had avoided thinking about that idea. Since Michael passed away, she had focused on stability, routine, and making sure Daniel grew up with love and support. Her own dreams had quietly moved into the background. "Why are you asking me that?" she said gently. Daniel looked down at the table for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes I feel like you stopped living your own life after Dad died." Emily did not respond right away. His words were honest, and honesty always carried a little weight. "Daniel," she said calmly, "my life didn't stop. It just changed." Daniel nodded slowly but continued watching her with thoughtful eyes. "I know that," he said, "but I also know you gave up a lot to make sure I had a normal life." Emily smiled softly. "That's what parents do." Daniel shook his head slightly. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't think about your own happiness too." The words hung quietly in the air between them. Emily suddenly realized that her son was seeing her differently now, not just as his mother, but as a person with her own loneliness and hopes. It felt strange, but also touching. "I'm happy enough," she replied gently. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Are you really?" he asked. Emily paused because she had asked herself that same question many times during quiet nights in the house. The truth was complicated. She loved her life with Daniel, but sometimes the silence of the evenings reminded her how much had changed since Michael was gone. "Life isn't always about chasing happiness," she finally said. "Sometimes peace is enough." Daniel studied her face carefully, as if trying to understand something deeper behind her words. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but I still think you deserve more." Emily laughed softly to lighten the mood. "You sound like someone giving a speech." Daniel smiled slightly but did not back away from the topic. "I just don't want you to spend the rest of your life alone." Emily looked at him with gentle surprise. Daniel had always been respectful and caring, but tonight he sounded almost protective in a new way. "You don't need to worry about me," she said kindly. Daniel leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "Maybe I do." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The radio continued playing quietly in the background while the evening sky outside grew darker. Emily realized something important in that moment. Daniel was no longer the boy she once comforted after nightmares or helped with homework. He had grown into a man who cared deeply about her well-being. "You've been thinking about this for a while, haven't you?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I guess I have." Emily folded her hands on the table. "Why now?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Because lately I've been realizing how much you've done for me, and I don't want you to feel like your life is over just because you raised your son." Emily felt both touched and emotional hearing those words. It was rare for children to recognize sacrifices so clearly. She reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "You didn't take anything away from my life," she said. "You gave it meaning." Daniel smiled faintly but still looked thoughtful. "Maybe, but I still want to see you happy in ways you might not expect." Emily stood up and began clearing the plates, partly to hide the emotions that had suddenly risen in her chest. Daniel watched quietly as she carried the dishes to the sink. "Mom," he said again, his voice softer now, "promise me something." Emily turned slightly. "What?" Daniel looked at her with calm seriousness. "Promise me that you won't close your heart forever." Emily looked at him in silence for a moment. His words were simple but powerful. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I promise I won't close it," she said. Daniel smiled with relief, as if that answer meant more to him than she realized. Later that night, the house grew quiet after Daniel went upstairs. Emily sat alone in the living room thinking about the conversation. The idea of opening her heart again had once felt impossible, but hearing her son speak with such honesty made her wonder if perhaps life still held new chapters she had never considered. Upstairs in his room, Daniel lay on his bed staring at the ceiling. He felt both nervous and hopeful because the conversation had only been the beginning. There was something important he wanted his mother to understand, something that would push emotional boundaries in a surprising way. He knew that when he finally said it, Emily would be shocked, not because it was wrong, but because it would challenge everything she believed about her own future. And that moment, the moment when Daniel would truly cross the emotional line that changed everything, was closer than either of them imagined. The next morning arrived quietly in Maplewood, and sunlight slowly filled the Parker house through the tall kitchen windows as Emily prepared coffee before leaving for work. The calm routine of the house usually made her feel peaceful, but today, her mind kept returning to the conversation she had shared with Daniel the night before. His words had been thoughtful, almost protective, and she could not ignore the feeling that he had been trying to tell her something deeper. A few minutes later, Daniel came downstairs wearing a simple gray jacket, his hair still slightly messy from sleep. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table across from his mother. For a moment, they simply listened to the quiet sound of birds outside. Finally, Daniel spoke first. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. Emily smiled lightly. "Well enough," she replied, though she knew her mind had been busy with thoughts. Daniel noticed the small hesitation in her voice and leaned forward slightly. "You're still thinking about what we talked about, aren't you?" he said. Emily gave a small laugh because there was no reason to pretend. "Maybe a little," she admitted. Daniel nodded slowly, almost as if he expected that answer. "Good," he said calmly. Emily raised an eyebrow. "Good?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Because it means you're at least considering it." Emily stirred her coffee thoughtfully before responding. "Daniel, life isn't always as simple as deciding to start over," she said gently. "Some chapters close for a reason." Daniel listened carefully but shook his head. "Or maybe people close them too early because they're afraid of opening the next page." Emily studied her son's face for a moment. The confidence in his voice surprised her. He sounded older than 23, almost like someone who had been thinking deeply about life and relationships for a long time. "You've been doing a lot of thinking lately," she said softly. Daniel smiled again, but his expression carried a quiet seriousness. I guess growing up makes you notice things you didn't see before. Emily nodded slowly. That statement was true for both of them. When Daniel was a child, she had protected him from many worries, but now he was beginning to see the world in a more complex way. After a moment, Daniel spoke again. Mom, can I tell you something honestly? Emily looked at him calmly. You always can. Daniel rested his hands on the table and took a deep breath before continuing. When Dad passed away, I know it hurt you more than you ever showed. Emily felt a small ache in her chest hearing Michael mentioned. Even after all these years, the memory still carried emotion. We both lost someone important, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. Yeah, but you had to stay strong for me. Emily looked down at her coffee for a second before responding. That's what parents do. Daniel's voice softened slightly. But I don't think you ever gave yourself time to think about what you needed. Emily felt touched, but also a little surprised by his honesty. Daniel continued speaking, his tone calm but determined. I've been watching you for years, Mom. You work hard, you take care of the house, you help everyone around you, but you never really think about your own future. Emily leaned back in her chair slowly. My future includes you, she said. Daniel shook his head gently. I won't always live here. The words were simple but powerful. Emily looked at him carefully, realizing what he meant. You're planning to move out? She asked. Daniel nodded. Eventually, yeah. Maybe in a year or two when I'm more stable at work. Emily had always known that moment would come, but hearing it spoken aloud made the house feel strangely quieter. Daniel noticed the change in her expression and quickly continued. That's exactly why I want you to think about your own life too, he said. You shouldn't feel like your story ends when I move on. Emily crossed her arms lightly as she considered his words. And what exactly do you think I should do? She asked. Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. I think you should open your heart again. Emily smiled faintly, but there was uncertainty behind her expression. It's not that simple. Daniel nodded. Maybe not, but it's not impossible either. The conversation paused when Emily stood up to rinse her coffee cup. Daniel watched her quietly, sensing that his words were reaching her but not fully convincing her yet. After a moment, she turned back toward him. Daniel, why is this so important to you right now? She asked gently. Daniel hesitated before answering, as if choosing his words carefully. Because I don't want to look back 10 years from now and realize you spent your whole life alone just because you were afraid to hope again. Emily felt her heart soften, hearing the sincerity in his voice. She walked back to the table and sat down again. You really care about this, don't you? Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah, I do. Emily studied his face closely. There was something different about him lately, something thoughtful and mature that had quietly grown without her noticing. She realized that Daniel was not just worried about her loneliness. He genuinely believed she deserved a new chance at happiness. Maybe you're right, she said softly. Daniel looked up with surprise. Really? Emily smiled slightly. Maybe I have been living too carefully. Daniel's expression brightened with relief. That's all I wanted you to admit. Emily laughed lightly. Don't get too excited. Thinking about change and actually making it happen are very different things. Daniel nodded, but his eyes carried hope. Still, it's a start. The conversation ended as they both prepared to leave for their day, but something about the morning felt different from every other day before it. Emily drove to work thinking about the possibility that her life might still hold unexpected chapters ahead. Meanwhile, Daniel walked toward his office with a quiet determination. He knew the emotional line he had crossed by encouraging his mother to rethink her future might surprise her, but he also believed it was necessary. Sometimes the people we love need someone brave enough to challenge the walls they build around their hearts. And Daniel was slowly preparing to say something even more surprising, something that would push that emotional boundary even further and force Emily to see her life from a completely new perspective. The days after their conversation passed quietly in the small town of Maplewood, but something inside Emily Parker had begun to shift. For years, her life had followed the same comfortable routine. Wake up early, go to work at the local library, return home, cook dinner, and spend the evening reading or watching television with Daniel. It was a simple life, one she had grown used to after losing her husband many years earlier. Yet Daniel's words had opened a door in her mind that she had kept closed for a long time. Now, as she walked through the quiet aisles of the library at work, organizing books and greeting familiar visitors, she often caught herself wondering what life might look like if she allowed herself to imagine something new again. Meanwhile, Daniel noticed small changes too. His mother smiled more often, and sometimes she seemed lost in thought in a way he had never seen before. One evening, about a week later, Daniel returned home to find Emily sitting on the front porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun set. The sky was glowing with soft orange and pink colors behind the tall trees, and the peaceful moment made the house feel warmer than usual. Daniel stepped onto the porch and leaned against the railing beside her. "You seem relaxed," he said with a light smile. Emily looked up at him and returned the smile. "Maybe I am." Daniel noticed something different in her expression, less tired, more open. He sat down in the chair beside her and looked out toward the quiet street. "Have you been thinking about what we talked about?" he asked carefully. Emily nodded slowly. "More than I expected." Daniel waited patiently, sensing she had something important to say. After a moment, she continued. "You were right about something, Daniel. I did close my heart after your father died." Daniel listened quietly, his expression serious but gentle. "Not because I stopped believing in love," Emily explained, "but because I felt like my role in life had changed. I believed my purpose was to focus on raising you and keeping our life stable." Daniel nodded. "And you did an amazing job at that." Emily smiled softly, but then looked thoughtful again. "But now I'm starting to realize something else." Daniel turned slightly toward her. "What's that?" Emily looked out toward the fading sunlight as she spoke. "Maybe life isn't meant to stay frozen in one chapter forever." Daniel felt a quiet sense of relief hearing those words. "That's exactly what I hoped you would realize." Emily laughed lightly. "You sound very confident in your advice." Daniel shrugged playfully. "Maybe I just know you well." For a moment they sat in comfortable silence while a cool evening breeze moved through the trees. Then Emily said something unexpected. "I actually met someone new this week." Daniel blinked in surprise. "Really?" Emily nodded, slightly embarrassed by the sudden attention. "A man named Robert came into the library a few days ago. He's new in town." Daniel leaned forward with interest. "And?" Emily smiled faintly. "We talked for a while. He seems kind." Daniel's face lit up with curiosity. "Did he ask you out?" Emily laughed again. "Not exactly, but he did say he enjoys visiting the library, so I imagine I'll see him again." Daniel looked pleased but also thoughtful. "That's a good start." Emily glanced at him with amusement. "You're taking this very seriously." Daniel nodded. "Of course I am. I told you that you deserve happiness." Emily placed her teacup on the small table beside her and looked at him carefully. "Daniel, there's something I want you to understand, too." Daniel listened attentively. "If I ever decide to open my heart again, it doesn't mean I'm forgetting your father." Daniel shook his head immediately. "I know that." Emily studied his face, wanting to be sure he truly meant it. "Your father was an important part of our lives," she continued gently. "Nothing will ever change that." Daniel smiled with calm confidence. "Mom, loving someone new doesn't erase old memories. It just means life keeps moving forward." Emily felt deeply proud hearing her son speak with such maturity. For years, she had worried about how he might feel if she ever thought about dating again, but now she realized he had already accepted that possibility long ago. The conversation drifted into other topics as the evening grew darker. They talked about work, the town, and small plans for the weekend. But something important had quietly changed between them. For the first time in many years, Emily felt like she was not simply surviving life. She was slowly beginning to imagine a future that held new possibilities. Later that night after dinner, Daniel sat in the living room reading while Emily washed dishes in the kitchen. She paused for a moment and looked out the window at the quiet street, thinking about the conversation they had shared on the porch. Her son had crossed an emotional line when he first challenged her to rethink her life, but now she understood that he had done it out of love, not rebellion. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones brave enough to say what we need to hear the most. When Emily finally turned off the kitchen lights and joined Daniel in the living room, she felt lighter than she had in years. Daniel looked up from his book and smiled at her. "You seem happy tonight," he said. Emily sat down on the couch and nodded slowly. "Maybe I'm just remembering that life still has surprises." Daniel smiled again, satisfied but also curious about what might happen next. Neither of them knew exactly where these changes would lead, but one thing was certain: the moment Daniel crossed that emotional line by encouraging his mother to open her heart had started something important. It had reminded Emily that her story was not finished yet, and the next chapter of her life might hold a kind of happiness she had almost forgotten was possible. The weeks that followed felt quietly different inside the Parker home, as if a small but important shift had changed the rhythm of life there. Emily Parker no longer moved through her days with the same careful routine she had followed for years. Something inside her had awakened after the conversations with Daniel, something she had kept hidden ever since losing her husband. Now, while working at the library or walking through town, she sometimes noticed little details she once ignored: the laughter of people at the cafe, couples walking together in the park, the warm feeling of evening light through the tall trees on Maplewood streets. It was not that she suddenly felt young again, or that she forgot the past. Instead, she simply realized that life had not ended the day she lost Michael. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Daniel had first challenged her to rethink her future, Emily stood behind the front desk at the library when a familiar voice greeted her. "Good afternoon, Emily." She looked up and saw Robert Hayes standing there with a friendly smile and a book in his hand. Robert had visited the library several times since the day they first spoke, and their conversations had slowly become longer each time. He was in his early 50s, calm, thoughtful, and easy to talk to. Emily had noticed that speaking with him felt natural, not forced, and that simple fact surprised her more than anything. "Good afternoon, Robert," she replied warmly. "Finished another book already?" Robert laughed lightly. "You recommended a good one." They talked for several minutes about the story before Robert hesitated slightly and then asked a question that made Emily pause. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" he said kindly. Emily felt her heart skip for a moment. It had been many years since anyone had asked her something like that. For a brief second, the old hesitation returned, the voice inside her reminding her how long she had lived behind emotional walls. But then she remembered the quiet evening on the porch, when Daniel told her she deserved happiness too. She smiled gently and nodded. "I'd like that." When Emily returned home that evening, Daniel was in the kitchen preparing pasta for dinner. The smell of garlic filled the air as he stirred the sauce on the stove. He looked up when she walked in and immediately noticed the small but unmistakable brightness in her expression. "Something good happened today," he said with a playful smile. Emily laughed softly. "You read me too easily." Daniel leaned against the counter. "So what is it?" Emily placed her bag on the table and hesitated for a moment before answering. "Robert asked me to have coffee with him." Daniel's face lit up with genuine happiness. "And?" Emily smiled again. "I said yes." Daniel clapped his hands once in celebration. "That's great, Mom." Emily laughed at his enthusiasm. "You're taking this more seriously than I expected." Daniel shrugged. "I just like seeing you excited about something." Emily sat down at the table while Daniel finished cooking. For a moment, she watched him move around the kitchen, realizing how much he had grown into a thoughtful young man. The truth slowly became clear in her mind. When Daniel first crossed the emotional line by pushing her to open her heart again, she had been surprised and even slightly uncomfortable. But now she understood that moment differently. He had not crossed the line out of rebellion or disrespect. He had crossed it because he loved her enough to challenge the quiet loneliness she had accepted for years. During dinner, they talked easily about simple things, but the house felt warmer than it had in a long time. Later that evening, Emily sat in the living room reading while Daniel worked on his laptop nearby, After a while, he looked up and asked something that made her smile. "Are you nervous about the coffee date?" Emily laughed softly. "A little." Daniel closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. "You'll be fine." Emily looked at him thoughtfully. "You seem very confident about this." Daniel smiled. "Because I know you deserve good things." Emily felt a wave of emotion hearing that. For years, she had focused so much on being a good mother that she had forgotten how it felt to simply live her own life. The next afternoon, Emily met Robert at a small cafe near the town square. The conversation flowed easily as they talked about books, travel, and the quiet charm of Maplewood. Emily found herself laughing more than she had expected, and the simple joy of the moment felt both new and familiar at the same time. When she returned home later that evening, Daniel was sitting on the front porch watching the sunset, just like she had done weeks earlier. He looked up as she approached and immediately noticed the peaceful smile on her face. "How was it?" he asked. Emily sat down beside him and looked out at the glowing sky. "It was nice," she said honestly. Daniel nodded, satisfied. They sat together quietly for a few minutes while the colors of the sunset slowly faded into evening. Finally, Emily spoke again. "Daniel, I want to thank you." Daniel turned slightly toward her. "For what?" Emily smiled gently. "For being brave enough to say something that surprised me." Daniel understood immediately what she meant. "Sometimes people need a little push," he said. Emily nodded thoughtfully. "You definitely gave me one." The two of them sat on the porch until the first stars appeared in the sky. The moment felt peaceful, not dramatic or overwhelming, but quietly meaningful. Emily realized that life had given her something unexpected, a son who cared enough to remind her that happiness was still possible. And Daniel realized something too. The moment he crossed that emotional line had not broken their relationship. Instead, it had made it stronger, turning their bond into something deeper than simply mother and son. It had become a friendship built on honesty, trust, and the courage to help each other grow. And as the night settled gently over the quiet town of Maplewood, both of them understood that sometimes the most surprising moments in life are the ones that lead us back to hope.